Hey, Tenen. I was just telling Luke how much fun I've had this weekend reading the Productivity Commission report for work. Ugh.
There's something analogous to the Netflix model of just dropping an entire season onto the service all at the same time. There's an opportunity here. They should be releasing a chapter per week and owning the conversation.
No,
Make it a
I
real
think the
water
timing
cooler report series.
And you could have a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter.
What happened to the Productivity Commission this week?
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, reporting today on Wurundjeri Land, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening. You may or may not be able to hear my infant child singing himself to sleep in the background. I believe you will, and I believe you can. But I am also coming to you from Gadigal Land.
And a man who bears his soul every day on the carefully curated bookcase that sits behind him during video conferences, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
I hasten to add that some of the things on my bookcase are jokes rather than cries from the heart. For instance, the book labelled How to Take Over the World is a very funny book that is about things like how to have a flying secret base or how to recreate a dinosaur and do various other over-the-top things that a supervillain might want to do.
But you would never do, ever. That would not be something you'd try and attempt if you were given the opportunity.
No, although the one in there about taking over financial systems by digging tunnels to banks to run ultra-fast communications through, that one's a little interesting, but it's been done.
I reckon of all the things sitting on your shelf that you could claim not to have serious intentions of, world domination is so not one of them, Tennant. I don't buy it for a second.
Spoken like a global vice president for marketing and extortion.
All right, on this week's show we cover a couple of papers that unpack the concept of climate clubs and what role they could have in accelerating international action on climate change. But first, last week AEMO released its 2023 Gas Statement of Opportunities, which led to a now familiar rending of clothes and gnashing of teeth over projected mismatches in gas supply and demand. Who or what is to blame for said mismatches and what we should be doing about it? Tennant, what did you make of GSU 2023?
Well, look, it's a good thing that this is an audio medium. Otherwise, our audience might see that my clothes are a little bit rent and my teeth are showing signs of gnashing because I think that the GSU 2023 actually is a bit worrying. So there's two broad categories of risk that are in it. One is the near-term risk over the next couple of winters that if a couple of things go wrong at once, we may have a couple of days in that period where there is not enough gas to meet demand at a point in time. And what kind of things are we talking about going wrong? Well, if we have exceptionally high demand due to exceptionally bad weather in winter, that would be a big sign that we might have a couple of tight days. And, if we have some more coal-fired power stations go kablowy and a higher than usual reliance on gas-fired generators to pick up the slack, that would not help as well. There's a bunch of recommendations in there about what to do about that. It's a real risk, but it's sort of manageable and it's not the expected outcome. Whereas from 2027 onwards, we've got the certainty in the absence of new stuff, and new stuff can be done one sort or another, but unless something beyond what's able to be firmly counted now changes, there is not enough gas expected to be in the market to meet the demand that is expected to be there. And the further out you look, the worse that mismatch gets. These kind of reports always, by their nature, show a mismatch between supply and demand eventually. That's their point. Like, when is it? Where is it? How much is it? Is what they're there to help us avoid. But this one's like, it's pretty close, and it's a lot closer and larger than last year.
Can I play devil's advocate to the two of you? Because I was only watching this at a little bit of a distance through the week, and I sort of clocked the response from folks like the Australia Institute that, were quick to point out that we've got an abundance of gas and we actually export most of it. Are we really, facing this sort of supply struggle in the near term? I guess the message that was coming out from those folks was, well, if we weren't exporting so much of it, we wouldn't have such a problem domestically.
I mean, it's absolutely true that from the East Coast, we export about 3 times as much as we consume locally. Like, mathematically, we could just cut back those exports as supply coasts or production coasts downwards. The people those exports are going to might have a thing or two to say about that, both those who have contracts, but also just we are in currently a bit of a tight spot globally on gas supply post-Ukraine. It's better than it was 2 months ago. It could get worse again. And so not caring about supply adequacy because the people on the wrong end of it are Johnny Foreigner is not great. Of course, their demand is going to go down in the long term. Like, international customers' demand is going to go away as they transition their own economies. But there'd be nerves in the medium term, I think, if the nation that was until quite recently, but I think we might be eclipsed this year, the biggest exporter of LNG in the world, sort of started sidling for the exit before its customers do.
Sorry, I was being a bit cheeky with that, but I noticed the two kind of, very different perspectives being put forward. Yep. And, whilst we talk about this stuff a lot amongst ourselves, I think it's worth kind of airing out all of that for the benefit of our lovely listeners.
There's a third and important perspective, which I think was put most eloquently by Tristan Eders in The Guardian a couple of days ago as we record, which is that, well, yes, where we find ourselves is unfortunate in some ways, like decisions that have been made by various political leaders over a period of time have led us to this significant mismatch, and you can have arguments about whether those international markets should have been opened up in the way they were without reservations for domestic use, and but that's in some ways a fairly moot point. We are where we are. And he goes on to make, I think, the far more productive point that there are significant opportunities both in terms of energy efficiency and fuel switching to deal with the mismatch from the other side of the ledger by lowering demand. He makes the point that just heating our homes consumes 90 petajoules of gas per annum, and heating hot water consumes 50 petajoules, and Victorian households account for 2/3 of that consumption. And in the context of, Victoria's now very significant emissions reduction targets from 2035, 75 to 80% reductions overall across the entire Victorian economy, that implies, very significant shift in, the carbon intensity of residential heating load. A few different agendas might be coming together in a fairly serendipitous way, an opportunity to both decarbonise homes through electrification and energy efficiency, as well as help to deal with this mismatch.
I think just in terms of reflecting on the fact that we do need to not be sitting here kind of lamenting the fact that there might be a problem in the medium term, that there are, a bunch of policy levers at our disposal that we need to move with. I would note, there's a pretty growing and substantial evidence base supporting the imperative to electrify Australia's building stock. I think homes is, across the bigger states, Victoria, New South Wales is one, but also commercial buildings, tenant industrial users as well. There's a lot of room to move on policies to support that agenda too.
My last word would be, there are a lot of things that we can do. They need to add up to quite a large gap filler, and one that gets larger and larger over time. And as of now, the last year's strategy, as it was visible in last year's GSU, was nonsense. It was, we're going to import a third of our needs from somewhere overseas through LNG import terminals, and which didn't have enough demand, and that we're going to achieve a very substantial amount of household electrification without any adequate visible policies to do so. Mm-hmm. And then this year they've corrected for those things in ways that are also nonsense. Like, they've just assumed that electrification is slower than last year, but they've ignored the policy stirrings from governments and the targets and all of that. They've counted the LNG imports as not definitely going to happen, while they're also projecting a shortfall that construction on one of those projects has started. So nothing currently coherently adds up. It needs to, it could, but it needs to, and it needs to soon. And across alternate supply, conventional supply, and various forms of demand reduction and efficiency and electrification and so on, whatever, it's got to add up.
Tennant Reid in a passionate plea for mathematics.
Yes. Why should it only be my 13-year-old who's on the receiving end of those?
I don't want to end this segment on, I'm ashamed to say that felt like a little bit of a downer. But I also just wanted to do a very quick shout out to Thomas Longden, one of the authors of the report that we talked about last pod. He reached out to us on our various socials, which was great. So thanks so much for clocking the pod. We hoped you enjoyed it. He did point us to a really good sort of explainer that the authors wrote up on the conversation as well. So I'm going to post a link to that in the show notes. But once again, that was it's really great when we hear from the authors of the papers we review on this pod. So it was great to hear from Thomas.
Frankie, are you telling me that the authors of that report had already summed themselves up?
I know. Well, I wasn't going to present it exactly like that because they did say...
I wish to raise a demarcation dispute.
I know. Well, they did say it was for a general audience, and I would say our audience of summer-uppers is a much more kind of...
Far from general.
wonkish crowd that we're preaching to.
Intelligent, good-looking...
Footnote-sipping, wonkish elites.
Yep. Please keep liking, subscribing, rating and reviewing us. And don't forsake us for articles on the conversation.
Yeah, well, look, those guys from the ANU should watch out, or we'll start writing papers, and then where will they be?
All right. Shall we chat about a couple of reports?
Oh, we should.
Where do you stop with these ones?
I don't know.
Nordhaus incoming. In December 2022, the G7 established a so-called Climate Club aimed at raising ambition and fostering collaboration on industrial decarbonisation in line with the Paris Agreement. It was a big moment for the concept of climate clubs, which have long been the subject of academic interest as vehicles for supercharging global ambition and action on climate change. So with climate clubs having a bit of a moment, we're digging into two papers on the topic. The first is Climate Clubs, Overcoming Free Riding in International Climate Policy, a William Nordhaus paper from 2015, regarded by many as a seminal contribution on the topic. The second is much shorter and much more recent. Climate Clubs, Politically Feasible and Desirable, was published in 2022 and is an attempt by its authors to establish a clear typology for climate clubs and pin down what they might actually be good for. But, Tennant, let's start with the Nordhaus paper, and I think to understand this paper, it's really important to know the exact period it was written in, right?
Yeah, so this was published in 2015. I don't know how long Nordhaus was mulling over it, but it certainly made a splash when it came out in 2015, and that is a point after the Kyoto Protocol is seen by most, if not all, to either have failed or to be in need of significantly revised and changed successor. But it's before the Paris Agreement was actually struck towards the end of that year. So Nordhaus is talking about what went wrong in his view, his very particular view, with the Kyoto Protocol in terms of not enough countries signing on to it and not committing to enough ambition to and executing on ambition to contain climate change, and what might be able to be done differently in a new kind of agreement going forward. It's maybe worth situating Nordhaus himself. We've spoken a bit about him in the past, and I'm probably understating it when I say not always in the most glowing of terms, but he is an extremely eminent economist. He is the inventor of integrated assessment models, about which we have said bad things galore, but they have certainly been very influential for good or mostly for ill. He's won a Nobel Prize or co-won a Nobel Prize for that, and he has been one of the go-to incredibly eminent economists for people who want to get an economist's view of climate change. Again, for good or for ill, maybe more for ill. So he's a big guy. He's sort of been in many people's minds associated with the view that it's not worth doing all that much about climate change. That's maybe an unfair characterisation to take that too far, but certainly his models produce relatively tepid responses to climate change. And so it was seen when this paper came out saying, let's have great big tariffs to force countries to act on climate change. This was seen as a major step by a cautious, maybe small c conservative but eminent figure to a more activist mode. And I can recall people at the Paris COP buzzing and muttering about this. Have you seen this Nordhaus paper and the direction he's going in? So it did make a splash, but should it have?
Well, I think the timing of this paper in particular is really fascinating. And I wondered whether he was angling, given his prominence, right, at influencing the direction of the upcoming Paris talks, of which he would have been aware there was an intention to strike the next major big bargain on climate that would have already been taking shape over the course of that year.
I think he's definitely trying to influence the post-Kyoto outcome.
Yep.
The timing isn't great for directly influencing Paris, but because of when it happened to actually all come together. But yeah, he's certainly trying to say we're moving on to a different phase. What's going to set us up for more success than last time?
And almost providing a alternative pathway that sits outside the UNFCCC process.
Yeah.
He's expressing a scepticism that UNFCCC will ever come up with anything suitably ambitious or robust. And then he's proposing this alternative pathway of climate clubs as a way of transforming the incentives that countries both within the clubs and particularly outside the clubs, because of the penalties that are potentially imposed on them, experience in relationship to ambition around climate change.
So who wants to say what the problem is that he's trying to solve?
There's a couple of things that Nordhaus is targeting, really, in terms of the failings of the structure of these kind of multilateral agreements, and I think some of the flaws that occur in big agreements where you've got lots of countries needing to sign up to do it. One, and he goes right back to the Westphalian dilemma, which I think is named after a Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So it establishes those.
30-year war.
Yep.
Foundation of the international system.
Or is it? This was one pleasant moment in what was generally a relatively unpleasant experience when reading this paper, taking me back to undergraduate political science classes.
Oh, really? This was all new for me. I did engineering at uni, so I'm just like quite fascinated, but first time I'm seeing any of this. So this goes back to the sort of central, as sort of Tennant alluded to, the like central principles of modern international law. The first one being, nations are sovereign and they have the fundamental right of political self-determination. Second, states are legally all equal. And third, states are free to manage their internal affairs without the intervention of other states. So that area for international collaboration has to happen, in and amongst those principles or founding principles, if you like, of the Westphalian system. And then secondly, he notes the problem of free riding, which I think he also does a good job of situating as well when he's reviewing the failure of the Kyoto Protocol as well. So the problem of free riding arises when you're getting, lots of countries to join an effort, and say if that's focused on climate change, then you're going to have, a cooperative carbon price that's going to get higher and higher because countries are pushing each other to do better. That's the purpose of those agreements. When that gets to a certain point, when the discrepancy between, that cooperative carbon price is much higher than, say, the non-cooperative carbon price, like what you'd just be doing as BAU if you weren't part of agreement, there's an incentive there for individual countries to defect out of that agreement. And so whilst overall, the problem is being managed and people are reducing emissions and, and that's all happening, that defector kind of free rides on the abatement of the remainder, of that coalition of countries. And that particular issue is really what Nordhaus is getting at with his suggestion of a club structure. Because he thinks, and he talks about it in the context of the Kyoto Agreement, his international norm of voluntary participation appears to be doomed with the failure of the Kyoto Protocol. And his suggestion that a club structure where external sanctions are imposed on non-members would be essential for effective agreements into the future. So that's the crux of what he's looking at here.
There was one other type of free riding, which he mentions a few times but doesn't really unpack, but notes it as significant, which is temporal free riding. Yep. So the current generation not reducing their own emissions and subjecting future generations to the impacts on like economic welfare and having to live with the environmental damage. But certainly the vast bulk of the paper is trying to deal with this sort of current international situation where the best case scenario for a country is that everybody else reduces their emissions and they do nothing, and that obviously can lead to everybody lowballing their action and nothing getting done, and this very suboptimal outcome being the one that is actually achieved because everybody acting in their own best interests is contrary to the common interests of everybody. I think there's something that's really important to note up front about this is a profoundly economistic sort of philosophical framework that this paper is being written in. It is sort of taking it as its core premise that nation states are going to maximise their own utility, and the vast bulk of the paper is given over to complex calculations around coalitions that are formed, the stability of those coalitions, the benefits of them for their members in economistic terms, without any significant recognition for all the other various factors that drive, the building of political consensus and decision making, and why nation states decide to do or not do things. he kind of flags it on the way through, with this delightful sentence, which I'm just going to read because it needs its moment. While history is full of wooden-headed actions of countries and their leaders, as well as policies that are far-sighted and attend to global welfare, attempting to incorporate these features is beyond the scope of this study of climate regimes.
Yeah.
Which one could read as, real life is beyond the scope of this study of climate regimes. You know what else history is not full of? Countries that set their policies based on perfect utility maximisation on behalf of their citizens.
There's so many problems here. There really, really are a lot. But I'll just say one more thing about the problem that he's trying to solve. Which is, I mean, you know, we could have a long discussion about the Kyoto Protocol, which really didn't work very well, both in terms of attracting participation and then enforcing compliance by those who did participate. But I just think we should really zero in on the problem that he's trying to solve is the international sharing of the burden of doing emissions reductions. And not the problems of the fear of carbon leakage or the fear of a loss of competitiveness. Sometimes these things are conflated, but his analysis actually is exclusively about the sharing of burdens, and his solution is exclusively about the sharing of burdens. And you could have that solution, I'll come back to this theme, you could have that solution implemented and still have problems of loss of competitiveness or carbon leakage in the context of climate change. So he's about, well, look, this emissions reduction thing, it's really important, but geez, it's going to be so costly. And how can we make sure that every nation is paying the same rate of cost, the same effective carbon price in every nation? Which is very particular, and we could unpack his carbon price, which is as abstract as any other part of his analysis. But why don't we turn to what his solution concept is? Because, the Kyoto Protocol had a punishment in it for participants who didn't meet their commitments, which was that you got even tougher commitments next time. It didn't work, because if you just said, bugger off, I'm out of here, and left, you couldn't be compelled. So what's his solution?
So he's got a very particular, and I think this is important to say, the second paper we're going to deal with is sort of like a much more sort of ecumenical and sort of says there's all these different types of climate clubs. They can operate in these various ways. We'll get to that. Nordhaus's idea of a climate club is very particular. Yeah. And so, you know, as we explain it, it's important for listeners to understand this isn't just what a climate club can be. This is the Nordhaus version of climate club. And just to sort of go through its key characteristics, a bunch of countries, they club together and they say, well, you know what, we all agree that we will have this carbon price applied within our economies, and it will be a minimum of X. And the one that is mentioned most regularly throughout the paper is $25 a tonne. But you could set that wherever you want. The countries have the option of, you know, getting to that price in whatever way they wish, whether it's through a carbon tax or a cap and trade scheme or some combination of the two.
All the flavours of the rainbow, country and Western.
Exactly. Nice Blues Brothers reference. And then the next part of it, it's got nothing to do, in a sense, with emissions reduction. It's effectively imposing a trade penalty on countries that don't sign up. So it's this 1%, 2% tariff, which is imposed on trade for countries that have not agreed to that minimum carbon price. And so it's kind of leveraging the international infrastructure of global trade and the trade regime to kind of supercharge interest and incentives to impose a carbon price and decarbonise. And it finds that if you do that, like, the benefits vastly outweigh the costs, and according to his models, and the incentives to actually join the club, impose the carbon price, decarbonise your economy so that you can maintain free trade and not be subject to this tariff, it all just works out. And he's run this model, with all these different scenarios, which shows that, invariably these coalitions of countries come together very, very quickly, and that they're durable, and that it's daisies and buttercups and sunshine and everything's wonderful. So we should just do it, right?
Well, I just want to put a small, just momentary pin in this chat about the idea of imposing uniform trade tariffs on many countries. A little bit akin to your reading of that line about, if I could paraphrase, the real world's not my problem to deal with. He does note that you would need to amend international trade law to provide for the ability to do this. So let's.
And what does that require?
It requires the countries that are going to be screwed by this policy to agree.
It does.
Correct.
Consensus, in fact, is what it requires.
I thought, and which clearly he doesn't say in the paper. All he says is...
There would be some challenges here, but I'm sketching the destination.
We would need to, pass a set of climate amendments to international trade law, both internationally and domestically, and they would need to, explicitly allow uniform tariffs on non-participants within the confines of whatever treaty this is going to be, or the club, and it would prohibit retaliation against countries who invoke that mechanism. And I was just
so China has to agree not only that America can whack it with tariffs, but that China can't whack back.
If you're wondering, summer uppers, why this particular version of a climate club has not yet materialised, you might be getting a sense of that through some of these things.
I was just halfway through this. I was like, Tennant, why did you make me read this? This is the dumbest paper we've ever had to read.
It's a load of dingoes' kidneys. So, yes, this is a problem. And now you could say global trade regime is actually not looking like an invincible tower of adamant that all men must quail and bow before. But also, if coalitions of powerful countries can just sort of get together and say, stuff the lot of yous, we're putting tariffs on you, and who cares what it says in the WTO or the GATT, which technically they can. There is also nothing to stop anybody who is not part of that club from levying their own retaliatory tariffs. And the specific simple maths of the model that Nordhaus has constructed here, I suspect that they will not add up to everybody's better off if there's a war of retaliatory tariffs going on. I think that would be a much more complex situation and one that might look pretty bad. This idea, I am at risk of prosecuting my little crusade for CBAMs, but his idea of the low uniform ad valorem trade tariffs is flatly contradictory to the letter and the spirit of everything in the WTO. Whereas CBAMs are entirely consistent with the spirit and the letter of the WTO. He's saying, we'll just sort of get agreement to fundamentally change it in ways that will be seen as greatly disadvantageous to a significant chunk of the people who have to agree to make that change. Whereas the other pathway, it's not the other pathway because CBAM is not solving the same problem. It's solving a more important problem. But his idea is, in specifics, I think it is just a fresh version in a slightly different format of the kind of useless ivory tower economist trope of we assume a globally uniform carbon price. It's another will-o'-the-wisp.
It's international climate policy fan fiction. That is literally all it is. It's hard to find an idea in here that has any hope of flying in any way, shape or form in any reality-based scenario that any of the three of us will ever participate in. I don't know which timeline this could credibly transpire in.
I think if the starting point is, if this is an even narrower assessment of the kind of parameters and considerations that would go into policy debates than IAMs are, which, like, you know, the way that those have evolved over the years are making attempts to quantify, like, however badly, different externalities, market failures, the impact of climate damages, all of that over time. I just think it's too easy to poke holes in this when almost none of those other externalities, like your point, Tennant, about the reality of trying to impose trade tariffs on a bunch of countries that can just turn around and do the same thing, is not considered here. So I'm really unsure how to view the rest of the substance of this paper, because he, you know, then goes through the results of his model, you know, where he looked at a bunch of different combination of regimes where he had, I think he had 7 regions of the world grouped together that are part of this club, and he ran his model for a few different carbon prices. Was it $12.50, $25.50, $100, and then 10 or 11 different tariff rates, and he says his remarkable result is that every regime produces a stable coalition.
Remarkable. This made-up thing.
And
it wins every time.
And, you know, and for low target carbon prices, almost all or most countries join even for very low tariff rates. I just don't know how to really comment on all of this, given the flaws in the input. Is it worth talking about? I just, do you read the findings? It's just so disconnected from reality. I'm not really sure where to start.
I think all of that is true. I think that bad ideas can be quite influential, and so it can be worth going through them. And for that matter, like the model that he uses, like bits and bobs on top of the DICE integrated assessment model. So all the things that are wrong with that model are still there. They don't particularly matter for most of his conclusions here. They do matter for one, I think, at least one, which is he finds that it's quite hard to put together a globally uniform carbon price of US $100 a tonne. Like, it delivers less global abatement than a global carbon price of $50 a tonne in his model. And, like, if you dig into it, I think the reason why is just that he's got the same terrible assumptions about how immensely expensive it is to reduce emissions at all that have always been in all versions of this thing. And so even if you assume that the social cost of carbon, the damage that carbon emissions do, is really high, it's still not worthwhile acting fully in accordance with that, because it's so terribly and inflexibly, infinitely, forever hard to reduce emissions. Then it's a sad commentary when those kind of things are in there, and that's not actually the biggest problem with this paper, or even on the top 10.
Oh boy.
But it did have an impact, this paper. Like, it put this idea on the map, and the vibe of something trade penalties as a way of getting some juice into climate action.
Yeah. I was aware that this thing existed. I had never read it before, but my sense is that it inserted a kind of an action man idea into the, you know, how we're going to solve this thing, how we're going to inject ambition and momentum into frustratingly glacial progress that we've seen on the international stage on climate over the last, several decades, and it's just, we're just going to do it.
Yeah.
There's going to be a band of burly men and women that will step in, and they're just going to fix their own emissions, and they're going to, go around and kick everyone else in the shins until they join their club. It's you've got a nice economy there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it.
I mentioned, at the dinner table, I mentioned that we were going to be talking about climate clubs, and I gave a brief description, and my family said, "Oh, you mean a gang?"
Climate gangs.
Oh dear.
Ruffians.
Outlaw motorcycle clubs, but for climate. Climate's Angels.
The title of this episode has just written itself rather. Honest question though, the use of universal trade tariffs as the sanction here seems to be like the key differentiator.
I think very much so. The impact of this paper was, after years where every now and again some French government official would say, we need carbon tariffs on bad players, and everyone would go, yes, yes, France, we're all Anglo-Saxon capitalists, shut up. Well, the Anglo-Saxon capitalists would say that. Now suddenly here's William Bloody Nordhaus saying it's time to link trade and climate to force countries, including the US, to do the right thing. And so as nonsensical as a huge part of the workings of the paper itself is, I think the impact of that Nixon goes to China type moment was quite big. So who cares if it's nonsense?
Should we talk about the other paper?
Yeah.
It's much better.
So, what's it called?
It's called Climate Clubs, Politically Feasible and Desirable? ?
Which is much shorter. It's kind of like taking a step back, going, there's all this talk about climate clubs, particularly among academics and particularly post-Nordhaus intervention, but the term climate clubs is being thrown around in all these different contexts, meaning all these different things, and let's just take a step back, define kind of the types of things that people are talking about when they say climate clubs, and then just consider what their utility may or may not be, what they could plausibly achieve, right?
Yeah. I got the sense that the authors of this paper had a bit of frustration just from the use of the term being thrown around and it meaning anything from, the Nordhaus acolytes version of a climate club with, strict sanctions around non-participation to more normative commitments on voluntary initiatives trying to gee up momentum for the broader process. And so I thought it was really useful that they sought to provide that typology of the different clubs splitting into three different chunks. It seems a good place to start.
So their typology is that there's normative clubs, there's bargaining clubs, and there's transformational clubs. And the transformational ones are the Nordhaus type. It doesn't have to be Nordhaus's very specific design, but they've got a penalty stick of some sort to encourage non-participants to participate and participants to straighten up and fly right. And then the bargaining ones are minilateral forums as opposed to multilateral forums, smaller groups of key players particularly who can come together and share some commitments maybe, but get things done in a smaller, more workable setting than 190 plus countries at COP. And then normative clubs are just like coalitions of the willing who get together and say, we share a commitment to something good and we're here to celebrate something good. And so, like, examples-wise, transformational, well, there are none yet. bargaining clubs. There's the Major Economies Forum that the US government has at times run. And the Group of Seven at times is a minilateral forum for this stuff. And then the normative, I had the same thought that was then in the paper like a couple of paragraphs later, which is the Powering Past Coal Alliance. A bunch of countries get together and say, we are phasing out coal in our economy, and they have no sanctions, they have no resources necessarily, at least not internally, but they sort of get together and promote a message and a shared value.
Australians would be familiar with the methane pledge that we signed up to at
Yes.
COP27. There's the goal of cutting methane emissions by 30% by 2030. It's signed on to a statement. Everybody's presumably doing stuff in that broad direction. Nobody's tracking it. There's no penalties. There might be some reporting mechanisms in there that countries have committed to, but there's no big stick and no penalties if that goal isn't achieved. But it, focuses the mind and hopefully builds some momentum.
Well, I was going to say, I think these authors are saying that there's a place for clubs of all of these types, but it's, useful to start to characterise them a little bit more accurately. I thought what was really interesting was the contention at the outset of the paper, which is, a growing number of scholars and practitioners think a stringent climate club is needed to save international climate cooperation from failure. And then later on, when they talk about the findings of interviews that they conduct with practitioners of international climate diplomacy, which shows not many of them know what climate clubs are in the first place at all, which tells us there's some work to do, I guess, with certain cohorts.
Well, between late 2021, when they published this paper, and December 2022, when the Group of Seven advanced economies established something called the Climate Club, something must have happened.
Something triggered.
And something did. Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of Germany, got very excited about something he understands to be called a climate club, which may not have a lot of content, I'm not sure. And he put it on the agenda. And Germany was president of the G7 for last year, and so it's made some strides. We will come to in a minute, like what if any the content of that is, but it's an evolving space. Although it was remarkable how little all the people they spoke to knew about this topic.
That seemed very odd.
They had very basic responses on it.
I mean, my day job does not require me to engage day to day with international relations, and I had a general idea of what a climate club was. It might be because I spend far too much time talking to you, Tennant. I'm not sure where that idea sort of filtered into my brain. But for practitioners, particularly in light of what you were saying before, of the kind of the dust that was kicked up by Nordhaus's paper in 2015, that they had kind of no idea what this was and had to have it explained to them, these 24...
There were a bunch of diplomats, there were a few policy professionals and scientists, there was one person from the UN Framework Convention.
Yeah, like you would think that the broad idea of what a climate club might have, penetrated the old noggin. I was amused when this paper sort of veered into our old friend Phil Pinions. So we'll just go and talk to some random people and draw some conclusions.
Sure, the sample size of 24 is definitely conclusive.
24 apparently poorly informed.
What does the man on the street think about this? If the street is in Bonn, Germany.
Well, it was interesting how you're saying that there aren't really examples of transformational clubs out there. But one of the survey respondents, when given some more information about it, thought that the EU came pretty close to that in terms of what they're doing. And actually, like on the face of it, legally binding membership rules, tangible benefits of being in the club, sanctioning mechanisms, like I guess particularly in the context of the EU looking to establish its own CBAM. You know, that was probably not a bad little insight. Do I think they need to go talk to more people? Yep.
Yeah, and I guess the thing to say about the few opinions, to the degree that they're useful, there was a fair amount of scepticism about this whole space, and particularly the transformational style clubs, and it was on a few vectors. You know, they were concerned about it undermining the UNFCCC process, and they thought it was really important to be for the engine room for climate ambition and action to be one where sort of everybody has a stake and everybody's in the room. They were writing this paper particularly in the context of ideas around the EU and the US getting together and forming a bloc which had an equivalent carbon price and was imposing some sort of sanction on folk that weren't joining them in that effort. And the concerns of the diplomats and others that they spoke to as well, that introduces pretty significant equity issues if you've got a couple of big, bad, developed regimes clubbing together and trying to find the rules of the road for the rest of the world, much of which is not in a position to throw that sort of weight around in the same way. So, I don't know, the straw poll didn't come out great for climate clubs, I think we can say, off the back of this paper. And I think the authors themselves are sort of a bit sceptical. They say, well, you know, they could be useful in certain contexts. Certainly the two that already exist, they have their benefits as well as their shortcomings. But I think, what do they say? They're no silver bullets,
no panacea.
That's the one, yeah.
I also think it's also worth reinforcing the point around equity and the countries that are being mooted as potential leaders of, you know, transformational clubs being the big hitters in terms of economic heft. I think countries would need to think very carefully about how they exercise their influence in that context, which actually I think the folks in the G7, if we're wading into that territory, whilst it's not abundantly clear exactly what they're going to be getting up to, I think they're at pains to be saying at the outset that this is an open and inclusive club that would be, you know, very much open to membership of countries beyond the G7 once it's up and running.
Yeah. I think that there's some very frustrating things about the UNFCCC as a forum, and a bit of competition, or even a bit of just countries doing things together outside that they then take into to try to strengthen outcomes inside the multilateral forum. Like, I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think that equity concerns can be real, but they can also... It's easy to fall into the trap of responding to climate change is horrifyingly expensive and everybody needs to try to pass off as much of the effort onto somebody else as possible, or, you know, only by absolute uniform equity can we spread these burdens. Like, well, the costs are actually different to that and the benefits are different to that. But you do need some concern that you're not just advancing narrow interest under a cloak of global interest that only a bit of the globe gets to say what it is. So having done the typology and the original Nordhaus recipe, which is a bit lacking, what is this thing that the G7 is doing, and does it have, well, like, which of these types is it, if it's any of them?
The vast bulk of what's in the terms of reference for this so-called climate club kind of seems pretty normative. It's sharing information. It's, you know, forums for discussion around particularly industrial decarbonisation, as we said earlier.
Yep.
I don't know. What do you reckon?
Well, I'd agree with that, but it also includes some very general wording around benefits to membership, which I think aren't, you know, it's too early for that to have been quantified properly, but given the club's stated, initial focus around on the decarbonisation of industry specifically, and I think the intention of wanting to bring commodities like green steel onto the market more quickly and, improving opportunities for them worldwide, I guess the intuition is that the benefits around membership would relate to, potentially trade benefits in terms of early access to import programs and things like that. That's what I read a little. So there's elements of the transformational in here, potentially.
Sharing best practices for industry policies and for the measurement and verification and reporting of emissions from these sectors, gesturing in the direction of harmonisation, but at least trying to better understand how everybody's measuring this stuff, including what's the embodied carbon in hydrogen, or trying to set common quantitative goals for growing demand for clean metals or clean cement over the decade. There's a bunch of worthy but very embryonic stuff in there. And then the closest I think they get to the Nordhaus vision is very slim and delicate waif-like language about the issue of carbon leakage and how they're going to share their mutual assessments of where the carbon leakage risks are and share possible solutions to carbon leakage. And that's about as far as it goes. So it's kind of a living embodiment of everything that the second paper, the Faulkner et al. Paper, says about how complex and tricky it is to actually, in the real world, establish agreement within a coalition on the details of what they're going to do. There's work here that's going to be carried forward by a secretariat, but are they going to get to the Type 3 transformation vision? You can't really see it yet.
So I'm keen to wrap up by kind of taking a step back.
Yeah.
Because, I feel like having gone through this typology, this second paper that sets out the normative and the bargaining, it's just a new name being applied to something that has already existed. It's not particularly interesting. It's, important and they play their role, but that's not the intellectually interesting element of all this. It is the idea of whether there is a scenario where you can create a coalition of nations that have an agreed set of policy settings and a structure can be set up around that, not necessarily the Nordhaus view of kind of, completely rewriting international trade norms, but something that would make it beneficial for other countries to join and be a part of that regime. Is that idea of creating enough gravitational pull around a particular block of countries that have aligned their rules, does that have any merit? Is there a world in which a transformational climate club could emerge?
So I think a couple of things. One is the Nordhaus, for an understandable reason that he was writing before Paris, doesn't give any consideration to whether the Paris Agreement approach can work. And we have been giving short shrift to Paris by not really talking about how it works. And it's too late to start now, except to say it's a fundamentally different approach and it's going okay, I think. You wouldn't want to only do that, but it's worth thinking through. You at home, audience, thinking about the Paris Agreement and how it's quite different to everything that we've talked about. But the other point is that, earlier I said, the Nordhaus sanctions version leads to either it can't happen within the trade regime or it leads to trade war. Well, what if we're heading towards trade war anyway?
Yep.
And maybe it provides one avenue for actually a de-escalation of trade war by providing a suggestion for a basis on which countries could step back from the trade limitations that they are currently busily putting on each other in particular blocks. If there is a deal on climate, could that be an excuse to step back from the brink of a wider dissolution of the trade regime and potentially dissolution of all of us? That'd be nice. I don't know. I think you need a more complex model than Nordhaus's one to explore that.
Or maybe no model at all.
Yeah.
Maybe just an analysis.
Wash out your mouth with soap, Luke.
Well, I just don't know how helpful it is in this context.
Yeah.
It's like, have a look at the imperatives of the various nations, the institutional structures that they're working with. Think about where the connective tissue could be built. I think it's an inherently political question rather than an econometric question. And, Nordhaus can do models till the cows come home. I just don't know how relevant they are.
A quick sketch of game theory tells you everything you need to know about how anything works, Luke. If we've learnt nothing else, surely it's that.
I've learnt to take a close look next time you suggest a Nordhaus paper.
Yeah.
You said, is this going to be Nordhaus redeeming himself? You dared to dream.
What were we thinking, Luke? Just like, so gullible.
It's time for one more thing, where we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
Sticking to our gas-driven thematic from our opening segment, but this time looking a little bit further abroad, and the IEA's done a neat little bit of analysis on the reduction in fossil gas demand from the EU over 2022, which fell by 55 billion cubic metres, or 13%, steepest drop in history. And even though it's early, they do some analysis to look at the reasons for that decline across the board. I mean, that's a huge amount of gas reduction in the course of a year. We know that there were unprecedented circumstances around that, driven by the war in Ukraine and imperative to shift the EU off of Russian gas. Yeah, so it breaks down the reason for that. So super interesting. It says that milder winter temperatures definitely played a role, harking back to our discussion on, what are some of the things we need to think about domestically as well. But they also, note that there were pretty substantial policy-driven changes, mostly record additions of wind and solar capacity in the energy sector. The demand for fossil gas in the energy sector actually went up in the year because they were compensating for, I think, year-on-year declines in both nuclear and hydropower output. So it pushed up the demand for it. That's it for fossil gas. So it's actually a net increase from the energy sector. But the other two significant sectors, the building sector and the industry sector, had substantial drops in gas. And, in the building space, weather was definitely a component. But they also talked about the impact of behaviour and fuel switching. So also in a high price environment, there were, and this is the not very nice side of things, I think you would see some people rationing their use as well, which led to some demand drop as well. But the impact of efficiency and the switch to heat pumps was pretty substantial too. So they clocked the amount of efficiency retrofits and boiler replacements, which were significant, and in the industry space, that was sort of put down to some production curtailment. So some industries were forced to respond to gas price shocks by reducing production, and sometimes that meant finishing products outside the EU instead of manufacturing them domestically where the prices were higher, but also included an amount of fuel switching too. So anyway, it was a great little breakdown of what was a pretty significant period of time in the EU. I commend it to you for reading, and I'll include a link in the show notes.
Ooh.
That's great. And in the interests of flow, I might do my one more thing now, because European Parliament last week passed a refreshed energy performance of buildings directive, which had a bunch of interesting stuff in it. As energy efficiency folk listening will know, there is a energy performance certificate regime in Europe. It's enforced and administered in different ways in different places in the EU, but they have classes of building A, B, C, D, E and so forth. And this new EPBD is squarely aimed at upping the renovation rate, which is currently sitting about 1% a year. And they are saying that they want non-residential and public buildings to achieve Class E by 2027 and Class D by 2030. And residential buildings have on a similar sort of trajectory. They've got a little bit more time, Class E by 2030 and Class D by 2033. So it's the first time actually having a minimum energy performance requirement in every building in the EU, which is pretty remarkable. Now, obviously, as we know, as Tennant has mentioned in the past with various other sort of big EU legislative efforts, this now goes to trilogue. So the Parliament's of a view. We await with bated breath to see what the European Council of Member States makes of all this. But one wrinkle which did come through in the negotiations and goes to Frankie's point about heat pumps is that there is or there was in previous drafts a requirement to phase out fossil boilers across the EU by 2035. Furious lobbying from a certain group of stakeholders resulted in a loophole being created for hydrogen-ready boilers, which is the subject of some contention in the European Union.
It's lucky listeners can't see my face right now.
So these would be gas boilers that could also burn hydrogen and could therefore be sold beyond 2035. Now, there's a fair bit of water under the bridge between now and 2035, so we'll see how that goes. But nevertheless, one to watch, and I know we've got friends in Europe that have been working very hard on the energy performance of buildings directive, and this is a step forward. So congratulations to them.
Very exciting.
Well, speaking of steps forward, or are they? My one more thing is no doubt at the top of everybody's to-read list anyway, although, well, I'm joking, but Frankie has already been into it because Frankie is super keen. It's the Productivity Commission's Productivity Inquiry 2023, Advancing Prosperity, Volume 6, Managing the Climate Transition. They dropped 9 volumes of this?
9 volumes, over 1,000 pages.
A lot of content there, and not just for this podcast. And so this is on my to-read list rather than something I'm going to give you the full skinny on now. But I have got some juicy bits from the PC's mini opus on where climate policy ought to go. And there's a fair bit of, classic original recipe Productivity Commission worldview in this paper. It's got a bunch of ideas about how to build on the safeguard mechanism, which we've all had so much to say about, and they at least have the decency, because every one of these ideas is politically unwelcome today, I would say, or just kind of non-responsive to the actual situation today. They have the decency to say, well, maybe these are ideas for the big review in 2026-27 of the future of, version 3 of the safeguard mechanism, something like that. But their ideas are make it economy-wide by broadening it to electricity and to transport, by imputing all the emissions from burning petrol to the people who supply petrol, and lower the threshold of it to its coverage to facilities with 25,000 tonnes or more of direct emissions. They want absolute baselines, not intensity baselines, and they say don't have any additional measures for emissions-intensive trade-exposed facilities, and no carbon border adjustment mechanism either, because something baselines are enough. And then, and this is the part that if you were in the audience and you were thinking, that sounds pretty interesting about those suggestions, why do they suggest those things? Because that means that you can get rid of basically every other policy with climate or energy in it. You don't need anything to promote uptake of electric cars. You don't need the renewable energy target or anything like it. You don't need anything if you've got one big economy-wide carbon price, which is a mental disorder that I was cured of some years ago.
I think that their very polite language in the report, Tennant, is to review and remove policies that are not complementary. Yeah.
But they have, on the topic of, they should bloody listen to this podcast, because they need to catch up with a thing or two that has happened in the last 15 years. They do say, the fact that renewables have gotten cheaper and electric cars have gotten cheaper, in their calculations, they don't quite explain it this way, but that makes policies to support those things look more expensive and to be gotten rid of in their analysis. And they don't have any thinking, evidently, about why those things have gotten cheaper. They just have the same old, a least cost approach to emissions abatement requires pursuing abatement options broadly in line with prevailing estimates of Australia's marginal cost of abatement curve. You just do what's cheapest now, or according to your estimates of what's cheapest now, and that's it. And you don't do the expensive things until much later, when, for some reason that escapes their notice, they will have become cheaper. So this could be an episode of its own, but maybe it's not needed now. There's a lot to unpack there.
You could just devote every one more thing for the remainder of 2023 to unpacking another choice paragraph from the Productivity Commission. Productivity Commission Corner. The segment all of our listeners have been waiting for.
I wanted to love this report.
They have a bunch of stuff to say in there about climate adaptation as well.
I didn't read it yet, but I'm worried.
Okay, well, let's chat.
I am not reading the 1,000-page Productivity Commission report for this podcast.
The climate bit's only a svelte 59 pages.
Oh, my God, here we go.
You'd be glad you did, Luke.
Yep. Let's talk offline. That is all we have time for on our show today. We're all on Twitter. Frankie is at
Frankie Muscovich.
Tennant is at
Tennant Reed.
My handle is at Luke Menzel. Tennant, what's our email address, and what could listeners do with it if they chose to?
Mailbag at letmesumup.net is the place to be in our society today, but particularly if you've got a paper that you would like us to read, if it's one that you think is a really great paper, or if it's one that you didn't like so much and you would like to hear us complain about as much as we have complained about some things today, send it in. We have done some audience suggestions recently, and they've been very rewarding.
Frankie, this is our 20th episode. If new listeners wanted to go and dig back into the back catalogue, the other 19 episodes, as well as the associated bonus content, where should they go?
They can go to letmesumup.net or providers of your podcast app of choice. We're everywhere. Can't keep us out.
All right. Well, that's it for today. For Frankie Moskowitz and Tennant Reed, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
I didn't want to be quite as down on the Productivity Commission as I was, but
You've been on your road to Damascus. I'm sure the Productivity Commission can go on a journey.
yes.
And you're the man to take them, Tennant.